Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan, and I'm delighted to have with me David Cherry, who's kindly agreed to come and share some of his life story with you. And I do want to mention the name of the group. The cult that he was involved with was called Enthusiastic Sobriety. Is that right, Dave?
That's kind of because they have so many different names,
Right.
but they claim their approach to recovery is enthusiastic sobriety.
Right, and it was founded by Bob Meehan, and there was a very long, detailed, good piece in Atavist that shared your story in particular that we will link to. And you were very high up in this cult. You were in 15 years, and I'm delighted that you're willing to share a bit of your story with us. So, please, Dave, tell us a bit about drug rehab cults, please.
Okay. Well, I was 19 years old, and honestly, I had been in college. I failed. I moved back home with my parents, and I was very depressed. And I had been depressed for a while, but nobody knew that. I grew up in an ultra religious Southern Baptist family, and I never felt that I connected. I mean, I tried to be saved, so to speak,
Hmm.
but I never felt that in my heart, and I ended up going through a what was a legitimate drug treatment program, inpatient drug treatment program for 7 weeks. And I came out and I found a group called Palmer Drug Abuse Program. And Palmer Drug Abuse Program was founded by a man named Bob Meehan. Um, Bob Meehan had already been run out of this group. So they grew and grew and grew. 60 Minutes in 2020 did an expose and basically, without directly saying it, accused Bob Meehan of being a cult leader. He was taking money for referring kids to private for-profit hospitals while directing this nonprofit support group program. And they had tried to clean it up, but it was still very, very cultish. They didn't know, they didn't understand what it was that made them problematic. They thought they could make this person go away and everything would be okay. But all of these people that had been working there were trained by him or trained by his disciples. And so I got involved in that level. And really, well, I got hired to be a staff member 6 months after I got involved. I had no training, no education. They sent me through a counselor training school, and I ended up. I got involved where my family lived in St. Louis, but I ended up in outside of Detroit, Michigan, working for a new chapter of Palmer Drug Abuse Program there, and things got really harsh after I got on staff. Things changed a lot. And I ended up leaving after a year and moving back home. But the chapter of Palmer that I had gotten involved with was falling apart. And I felt compelled to try to be helpful. And through a series of situations, basically the board of directors for this St. Louis organization connected with Bob Meehan, who said, I can save the program. And that's how I met Bob Meehan. And at that point, I think I was 20. Bob flew into town. What I didn't know at the time was that he was in the press out in California. He was running a program called Freeway out there, and they were running him out of town. And he was in the process of being fired from Freeway. He needed a place to connect so that he could continue his game.
Mm.
And my father happened to be the president of the board of directors of that St. Louis chapter. So when he came in town, he connected with me because he knew in order to get, my father and the board of directors on board, the best approach was to connect with me.
Right.
And so he met with the kids in this support group. He met with the parents, and he announced that I would be running the program for a little. He didn't tell me about this. I heard it when everybody else did. Basically, I would be in charge until he could train a director to come in. And at the time, I was a full-time student in college, making straight A's. My mother was terrified that I was going to drop out of school. That night, that first night I met Bob Meehan, he took me to his hotel room and we sat up till 5 o'clock in the morning. He connected with me and talked to me about how much he was like me and the things that I'd been through. And I really thought this guy was he sat me on the floor and had me stare into his eyes, and you had me.
One of the oldest tricks in the book, stare into the eyes.
Yeah. I mean, hypnosis was such a huge part of all of this, right?
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
So you said that you had been depressed, but you didn't say you were shooting heroin or snorting cocaine or abusing alcohol.
I used alcohol and pot, probably pretty much like everybody else that I knew. This is the early 80s.
Typical teenager.
But I was a typical teenager in a very strict Southern Baptist family.
Got it. Okay, I just wanted to be clear because some of the cases I've done over the decades, the kids really had a serious drug problem, and the parents didn't know what to do to help, and they found some drug rehab cult or through word of mouth that used other parents to recruit them, to tell them if you love your child, you have to send them to our program.
Right.
It's just a money machine and not to help the person really get over their drug, but to make them good cult members. That would be different.
And the truth of the matter is that, as I got involved, I mean, over the 15 years I was involved, they put the label of drug addict on kids that had barely even touched drugs, all the way up to people who had serious addictions to opioids and, methamphetamine and cocaine. And I worked as a counselor treating all of those people, but we had assessment tools, but the assessment tool was used more as a way to convince the person that they had a problem. The minute they walked through the door, we already knew they had a problem. We had made that decision.
Right. Well, if they had money, probably.
Yeah. And if they didn't have money, even, we had ways to work around that.
I see.
So, for example, today, those enthusiastic sobriety programs have a nonprofit chapter that raises funds for scholarships for kids who can't afford.
So this group program still is functioning, is what you're saying?
Yeah. They have many, many chapters.
Have they gotten their act together? Are they doing actual good substance abuse stuff, or it's more of the same as far as you know?
From what I'm seeing, it's a lot worse.
Oh, it's worse.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So when I got involved, and basically what happened for me is, I was still in school, and I worked over the summer as a paid counselor in St. Louis, and in the new Bob Meehan, we changed the name to Crossroads. And then they opened up a hospital in St. Louis, a 60-bed treatment center. And
that's big bucks.
Yeah. So, about $1,200 a day per kid.
So when you were doing counseling, forgive me for interrupting, just for our listeners, had you attended any credentialed training program to do drug counseling?
The training program that they put me through was when I was in Palmer Drug Abuse Program, was a TADAC credentialed program. So that's the Texas Association of Alcohol and Drug Abuse Counselors.
Okay.
So that training was acceptable to become a certified addictions counselor.
Okay.
And back then, you didn't have to have a college degree. You went through the specialized training, and you took this you had to have 2 years work experience. You had to do a practicum, then you took a written and oral test and did a case presentation. And if you passed that, you would get your certification.
Oh, good. So you had some training and certification prior to being number 2 in command of a bad group that was harming you.
Well, yeah, I did. And when they opened this hospital unit, the person responsible kind of for connecting all of these support group programs, these enthusiastic sobriety programs with the hospital, he came to my house to pick me up to take me to dinner. And I was living with my parents at the time, and my mom actually saw him pull in and rushed out the car. And she said, "I want to tell you something. My son is brilliant." She's a mom, right? He's in school. He's an honor student. He's on the dean's list. Please do not offer him a job, because I'm afraid he'll take it, and he needs to finish college. And so I was studying both social services, right, and journalism. And my hope was to write about things like addiction and so forth. In any event, it wasn't too much later that this man, John Cates was his name, asked me to come down to Dallas. And I did, and he took me out to dinner, put me up in a nice hotel, and said, "Hey, I want you to run the hospital."
I want you to run the hospital. Nice.
Yeah. And he offered me what seemed to be really good money to, a kid I was like 22, right? And I called my parents, and they said, "Don't do it." He had flown my girlfriend, who was, at that point, it was pretty clear we would probably end up getting married. He flew her down as well. And she was the one who said, "You got to take this job." They worked on her.
You were getting the full court press, and they were
Right.
using her also to pressure you.
Right. So I took the job, and from there I ended up being sent to Atlanta. Then I went to Houston. Then I ended up in Phoenix, and then in Phoenix was really where that's where Bob Meehan ended up being located. And once I got in the same city with him, things got really, really tough. And
When
the
you
whole
say tough, you mean abusive.
abusive, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. The thing that attracted me to the organization was this idea of loving people unconditionally. And not just loving people, being loved unconditionally. I had been seriously depressed, and I did not feel depressed anymore. I was a part of something. I felt like we were going to change the world. Our organization was growing, and I had people telling me that I had saved their lives, and I throughout the process, I was the person who, and I'm still today the person who reads and learns, and so I ended up running Bob's hospital unit in Phoenix, and then I opened a residential treatment center for him called Step 2 Recovery Center. Then I opened Step 1, which was for adults, young adults. And then I started and ran the Meehan Institute for Counselor Training, where counselors came to Phoenix to go through
And
training.
Meehan doesn't really have any training. You had a lot more than him, didn't you?
Yeah. I mean, first off, I was nationally certified addictions counselor. So I had those necessary letters. But I was a person who read and studied, and
Yeah, and you were passionate and you cared genuinely about people and helping them.
right. And like, I had to teach pharmacology, right? For example. Okay. So I had to know pharmacology to be able to treat it.
Right.
And of course, I had been pulled out of school, but I knew where to get information and where to learn, and so I did. Um, and But that was also scary to Bob Meehan and his wife Joy. I was running the parent programming too. I was doing the parent education stuff. So I was clinical director for Step 2 Recovery Center. I was clinical supervisor for the outpatient programs called Pathway. I was the program director after a while. It was all the adolescent programming for charter medical, which was all under Meehan's care. I was the executive director of the Meehan Institute, and I was half owner and creative coordinator for Clean Edge Productions, which we ran a coffee shop for young people, and we also had social functions, parties and raves and concerts and things like that. And we would draw hundreds of kids every
So were
Saturday
you
night.
making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year with all?
Yeah, no, I mean, I could barely pay rent, right? I was
So you
married.
were doing all these high functioning tasks that normal people get 50, 75, 100,000 or more to do. So he was using you as slave labor in a certain level, right? And
Yeah. And I mean, I didn't have time to sleep, right? Or think, or, it
so
was
so
rough.
you kindly filled out the bite model of authoritarian control in terms of your experience, which we will link to in the blog that will go along with this video. But you've read Combating Cult Mind Control, you've read my stuff. So what would you call it, an authoritarian cult system or?
Yes. Yes, of course. Um, yeah, interesting. Philip Helberg.
Yeah, the lawyer Philip
Yeah.
Ellsberg. Uh-huh.
Um, he said at one point that he saw it as the most sociopathic cult he'd ever seen. And I think the thing that is the hardest to get across to people is, I didn't sign up for this, and I didn't have all the information. I didn't have. I'm convinced there was information that I didn't have even at the time that I left. There was always more being revealed, and it was revealed in ways like when they broke me away from my family. Okay, I showed up one night for what we call a purpose meeting. Every other week we would have these meetings, and they were like our therapy, the staff's therapy, right? Because we all had to be taken care of for our problems. And
Oh, it's a psychotherapy-esque cult. So
yes,
the,
yeah,
the people who were volunteering to counsel or people who were underpaid to counsel were getting continually indoctrinated and re-indoctrinated so they
hmm
could be good clones to do the business, right?
exactly. I mean, and we all came up through the ranks of the program. So we called ourselves clients and staff, right? Um, and I walk in for this purpose meeting, and our spouses go too, okay? And they whisk my wife off to another room. A couple of the women do, and the director of the outpatient portion of the organization in Phoenix says, hey, Dave, you don't have to stay for this. You can walk away if you want. But I want to let you know this meeting tonight is going to be about you. And, so this terror goes through you, right?
Right.
And now I had been afraid anyway, because what had started to happen was people, I'd walk into a room, people were whispering and they'd be quiet. I mean, this goes on for weeks. All of a sudden, nobody's calling you anymore, and you can sense that, you're going to be in trouble. Okay. And he said, if you want to pray, man, you can use my office, and I got down on my knees. I was just terrified. And, I prayed. And I went into that room and I was subjected to, 5 hours of being told I was evil. I remember one person saying, I know that I'm supposed to love you unconditionally, but I don't see a single redeeming quality in you. There's nothing there to love.
Oh, Dave, so I've done so much work with cults that use breaking sessions and hot seat techniques, and it really is straight out of the Chinese communist break them down, build them up in the image of the proletariat or the cult, and create the new identity and reinforce it. It's really, just tear them down. And for someone who is at such a high level in the organization, it must have been really painful for you.
It was, they took my wife and they coached her, right? And this was actually a longer process, because what they did was months earlier, they did a hot seat with her. And, they made her afraid that I was going to leave her and all this.
Were you in the room when she was on the hot seat? So I just need to interrupt and say another pattern I see all the time with authoritarian cults is using your spouse. Many cults set you up and tell you who your spouse is going to be and who you're going to marry,
Right.
like in my former cult. But in your story, they brought her down to sell her on the job. So they were already using your emotional connections to her.
Right. And then her recovery from that was them starting to tell her the reason she had all those problems she was confronted for was because of me.
Oh, yeah. Standard operating cult procedure.
Right. And then, I mean, in this meeting, she said, look, I married you. And I was young, but, if you don't get it right now in this room tonight, you're not coming home.
Nice threat.
And when she said that, the girls put their arm around her and one of the men I knew was at my house with my daughter, who should have been in that meeting. But I knew what would happen if I tried to leave and go home. They would whisk my daughter out of there. They would have my,
Yeah, that's called coercion. So did you sue them, Dave?
I did not. I did not.
Sounds awful.
I mean, that was a horrible experience. And, there was a lot of that kind of thing, but really the truth is most of it was your standard thought reform. We lived in fear all the time because it could happen. Something could happen. Everyone was afraid they would, be kicked out, and to leave meant to die.
Yeah, that's the universal phobia programming, that you only have a right to exist if you're in the group. And this goes back to the Chinese communists. It's called dispensing of existence. You only have a
Exactly.
right to exist if you're in the group. If you leave the group, you're toast. Yeah.
And I'm still uncovering some of those phobias today. I mean, I just reread Freedom of Mind and Combating Cult Mind Control, and I realized that some of the struggles I'm going through with work right now are directly related to this phobia, which we were constantly told that, if we did leave and we did happen to survive, we'd spend the rest of our lives working in a fast food restaurant. We would never, I who was, tasked with running all these operations, if I left, I was, only good enough to work at a fast food restaurant.
So
And
I'm gonna interrupt your story,
uh,
Dave. You're such a good guy and you're so experienced and talented. I want to teach you now. We're not doing therapy. I just want to teach you a technique that I use with my clients.
Mhm.
Right. So with the phobias, the hardest thing is remembering the phobias and when they were installed. Like
Mhm.
for me, I was out of the Moonies for 4 years when I first was exposed, or maybe it was 6 years when I learned about phobias in school, and I was like, what did they do in the Moonies? And then I remembered they brought me to see the Exorcist movie. And then we
Right.
went up to see Moon, and he said, God made this movie. This is a prophecy of what will happen to you if you leave the Unification Church. This girl with a so called demonic spirit and all that stuff, the green vomit. So I stopped having doubts for the rest of my involvement. But the key technique is once you understand that, and if you read chapter 10 of Freedom of Mind, the key technique is remembering when it was installed and imagining if I knew then what I know now, what would I have done differently? And I really want to encourage you to revisualize. If it was Bob Meehan saying it to you, just be back in time in your younger self and say you're full of crap. This is a phobia. I know combating cold mind control.
Right.
Drop dead. I'm leaving.
And
Mom,
then,
pick me up. You were right. Shouldn't have gone with this person. You were right, Mom. Come and get me. So you can rewire. You need to identify the phobias, neutralize the phobias, right?
right.
So that when you're in situations, you know you have choices. You have a
Mhm.
voice. You know what to look for. You know what to say. So it's a very fast technique, but most mental health professionals don't understand it and they don't teach former members how to do that for themselves.
But I'm always surprised, I've done therapy. I did a little bit of counseling with Joe Zimhart when I first got out, and that was very, very helpful. But in therapy, none of the therapists I've seen, have any clue about dealing with cults. And I mean, these are people with PhDs, and
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah. No, I train folks like that now. It's age 67. But it's pathetic that even though it's such a huge problem in society and all over the world, people have these blinders on about how to tell the difference with undue influence and due influence and destructive authoritarian cults in all their variety of forms. Um, Joe's a great guy. He was in a cult himself, the Church Universal and Triumphant. Very, talk about well read. And he actually works in a psychiatric facility, I think, helping
mhm,
to do intakes, but he's not a mental health expert.
right,
So, but
yeah,
this is
and
what I
I mean,
focused on.
right, and he was very clear about that when I met with him. Um, One of the greatest things is he just in our very first meeting, um, he said to me, "Joy Meehan can't get into your dreams." And when he said that, for a second, I like kind of expected that he would start choking or have a heart attack or something. I mean, really. And the thing is, it's like he said that, and it just became so real how crazy it was that, after being out of this cult for, a period of months, I still thought she was getting in my dreams.
Yeah, I can't tell you. I mean, Joe and I and us old timers who've been doing this for decades, how many people we meet, really powerful, educated, intelligent people, believe that the cult leader or the guru had supernatural powers and could like visit them while they're sleeping,
Mhm.
and that they would be struck dead if they said a negative word. And I can't tell you how many times in interventions or in counseling sessions I've looked the person in the eye and say, if any of that was real, I would have been dead decades ago.
Right.
Every cult says phobias about me. And okay, Sai Baba, who was a big, guru from India, who, supposedly was God and could read minds and do all these supernatural things. He would manifest things out of thin air, but they were sleight of hand magic tricks that were poor. Anyway, I'd be like, okay, Sai Baba, screw you. You got 5 minutes to strike me dead. Otherwise, we know you're a phony. And the person would be like, oh, don't say that. Don't say that. What am I going to do if you die? I said, trust me, you won't have anything to worry about. Let's look at our watches. Yeah. Okay, 5 minutes is up. Do you think you need another 5 to test the guru? And
Right.
then they
Yeah.
go, oh, you're right. This is stupid.
Right. Well,
But understanding other groups do it too takes
uh-huh.
away the mystique.
Yeah, and it was so great to read about all of this because, Bob Meehan and his wife Joy Meehan, there was nothing original about them once I started to read about what was happening in other cults.
Right.
With one of the funny things, looking back on it, I think I got the number for AFF out of the back of combating. But I
The
finally,
original one. Yeah, they've changed
uh
their name to ICSA, I think.
right. It was the old AFF before they became ICSA. And I decided to call, and Carol answered the phone. And I started to talk, and I said for the first time, I was in a cult, and I had tears streaming down my face. And as soon as I said that, I was in the car on my cell phone. And as soon as I said that, I rear-ended another car, and I was in a car.
All right, so that confirmed the phobia. If you say anything negative, bad things are going to happen to you.
And you, especially the C word, you didn't use that word. Cult.
Right, but the real message is don't be on your cell phone when you're driving.
Exactly. Exactly.
And the truth is, it's a big deal. I remember the first time I said to anybody, I realized the Moonies were a cult. It took me like 3 months after my deprogramming because it was too painful to say I'm in a cult. I was in a cult. But at the point that I said it, it was just like, you know what I mean? And
Right. Yeah, I was terrified of saying it. And, um, actually, I first read Combating Cult Mind Control because we had accusations of being a cult, and they put me up to trying to, um, help explain why we weren't a cult. And one of the books I picked up was Combating Cult Mind Control, and I read about Synanon.
the
And
original drug rehab cult with
right,
Charles
right,
Dietrich.
right. And Bob Meehan hung out with Charles Dietrich.
That's where he stole a lot of his techniques, the hot seat and all of
I'm sure. Yeah.
the arranging relationships and all of that was straight
Well,
out of
and
that.
so much of it came out of, time that he spent behind bars too.
Interesting.
He used to say, he used to talk about how they would basically turn somebody into, he called it their punk, right? somebody they could use for sex. And he said, what you do is, you just beat the crap out of them. You put them in the hospital and beat them worse than they've ever been beat. And then when they're, after they start to get well, when they're almost recovered, you take them and you do it again. And after that, you then say, look, I'm not going to ask you to, do anal sex. I just want you to, do this. And then from there,
Well, it's the grooming thing and the increments.
Right.
Massage my sore back and my leg, and then it just keeps escalating.
Right. And all you have to do is like raise your hand to scratch your head from that point on, and they win. So you own them. And it was so clear that he was doing that, after I left. That's what he was doing to us.
Yeah.
But again, I do want to stress the point that alone, if I had walked into that room and, somebody told me the meeting was going to be about me 10 years earlier, I would have told you, go screw yourself, and turned around and walked out.
Exactly. No one should allow themselves to be abused, but the system was rigged.
Right.
Using your daughter, using your wife, the setup.
And just believing that I was doing God's work,
So was religion part of this too?
Yeah, and it was very new agey, right? But when I first met Bob, he told me he was a Christian because I was a Christian, right? And I needed him to be that when I first met him because I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, but then I'm Christ-like, I believe in being Christ-like. And then it went into all this kind of new age stuff. And ultimately, I had to renounce God. There was no God. The closest thing, Bob Meehan said, the closest thing to God is me.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've seen this cult leader playbook before. Sure. I do want to comment, if I may, Dave, for our listeners and the blog users. The first thing to do when you're redoing the whole thing is like, how did you get involved in the first place? And what you want to insert in is a detailed, independent investigation into the leader and the group history. Mm-hmm. Because it's amazing how many cult leaders have criminal pasts, multiple divorces, history of assault and battery. It gets buried on the internet. You have to dig a little bit, but always look for the credibility of whoever is the founder. And if the guy didn't have any training in drug treatment, why would you want to be involved with them?
Right. Yeah. Part of the problem was there was an industry problem back then, because there were a lot of people that their only credential was that they were in recovery. And, especially in the 12-step circles, it was very, very common. And you see it in 12-step recovery groups. Like AA is a great thing for a lot of people, but there are pockets of AA that are very cultish. Very
cultish. I've heard from so many people who've read Combating, criticizing the 12-step.
Right. So back then, there, not having credentials, and of course there was no internet. In fact, when I got out, and I didn't do it right away when I got out, I searched all over the internet and could find nothing about Bob Meehan. And eventually I decided, because the thing is, I knew there were thousands of people out there who were victims that still felt guilty that they had, they didn't want it bad enough, or, They weren't willing to
Their
turn it over to
fault.
God.
They didn't try hard enough. They didn't pray hard enough. They had bad karma.
And these people were dying. They were committing suicide. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Drug overdoses or just failing in life. And nobody would say the cult word. I would run into former members and I'd say, well, it's a cult. And I would watch them, be terrified. And, well, Bob Meehan was kind of crazy, but, and that's why I decided to launch on the MS.com back then, was to get some information out there. And I also thought that as soon as one person started to use this language and, and I wrote extensively explaining, the criteria and how Meehan met that and so forth. We had hundreds of people coming and sharing their stories, and we had a message board, and then of course we got national news attention. I think you remember all that.
Yes.
And
Is
I
the
did
site
that
still functioning now, Dave?
So now it is enthusiasticsobrietyabuse.com. And what ended up happening, I got very sick, in and out of the hospital for 3 years. And I couldn't do it anymore. I was having death threats and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so some people picked up kind of where I left off, and it was a few years later. And they have created this fantastic organization where they're reaching out, they're helping people, they're finding help for people, they're educating people.
Great.
They have a mass complaint forum, they're gathering data. And the beautiful thing is I can help them, but it's not dependent on me.
Yeah, you paid your dues, and it's so good for younger people to pick up and carry on one's efforts.
Right. Yeah. And they're better at it than I was.
Yeah, because they were raised on the internet and we weren't.
That's right.
For sure. So I just want to mention I'm part of a group called hashtag I Got Out. And it was a thought that we had after the Me Too movement got picked up, because so many people came out of the so-called closet to say I was abused as a child, men and women, although most people think of women. And we a bunch of my colleagues who are former members were like, let's do IGotOut.org and let's start messaging hashtag I Got Out from whatever it was, a controlling relationship, a religious cult, a political cult, controlling boss, to normalize it and to destigmatize it and to share resources for recovery, because it really does help to learn other group stories, people's stories.
Absolutely.
You're not alone, and there is a community of survivors, thrivers.
Right. And one of the things I found too, in terms of connecting with people that I didn't know in the cult that I was in, is, so many times connecting with the people that I was very close to in the cult, those relationship dynamics start to resurface. And we start to see each other as, however we were portrayed when we were in the cult. That doesn't happen with people that I didn't know when I was in the cult.
100%. But the good therapy that I recommend, and I do, is really about undoing your cult identity, so you don't have that unconscious dynamic. Because what happens is there's a dissociative disorder, right? Your real self, your cult self, then you get out. But unless you kind of absorb and exit counsel yourself, your younger self, out, it intrudes in many ways in one's life. And, so when I was a leader in the Moonies, when I would meet someone who was a low ranking in the cult, a fundraiser, you know, and they'd be like, I always admired you and I always looked up. And I'm like, I admire you for not getting into the corporate
Right, exactly.
cult suck, you know, where I would have died on command and killed on command because that's
Mhm.
where I got to the my programming. So, and they'd be like, "Oh, that's interesting. You think I'm, you know, more successful because I wasn't promoted?" And I'm like,
Right,
"Yes, less
right.
guilt, less feeling of, you know, investment in the hierarchy to run the damn thing and harm
Yeah.
people. We were
Well,
harming people."
I have to say, I mean, we spent 3 years working on the Atavist story. And that really came out of, I have my story on the internet, um, and the writer found that and read it, okay, and then contacted me. But we spent 3 years on that, reading that, and then recently rereading Combating and Freedom of Mind, coupled with some things that I've been going through. Really, I realized how much more work, there's a big piece that I just didn't address. There are things I just didn't address. And I thought I had, you know. I mean, I've been out since 1998.
Yeah, it's
It was,
peeling back the onion, right?
uh-huh.
And I gotta confess, I've had experiences too. The last big one was about 20 years ago, but that's still 25 years out. I had a situation where I was at the University of Bridgeport. The Moonies were on campus. You know, they bought it and everything. And a man who later became mayor was escorting me around for me to tell people how bad the Moonies were. And he said, "Oh, there's the local Moonie." And I walked up to him and I said, "Hi there, I'm Steve Hassan," to shake his hand. The guy was built like a football player, like a linebacker, and he started going like this, and my friend stepped in front of us and
Uh-huh.
like pushed me backward, and I'm like, "Bill, what's up?" He said he was going to hit you and you weren't doing anything to
Right.
protect yourself. I'm like, "It's okay if he hits me, you know, I've been hit before by Moonies." And he's like, "Steve, there's something not right with you, buddy. You could like have brain damage, you could lose teeth, you can break your nose. Like you don't want big people to punch you in the face."
Right.
So I went to my psychologist. They said I had this weird experience, and this was like 20 years, 25 years out of the Moonies. And he said that it is not a normal reaction to a big person about to punch you. And I remembered back to this programming that I'm a saint and I have to serve people and it's okay to sacrifice myself and my body for the greater cause. Like that was the root.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm just validating you're not alone. We have to
Huh?
do the work, and each one of these things that happen, that it's just your unconscious saying more work to do.
Right.
Pay
Right.
attention.
I appreciate that because, sometimes it's weird because, I was working 60 hours a week at my job and driving myself into the ground, and even working off the clock so that I didn't clock overtime. And my roommate, who doesn't know anything about cults or very little, said to me one day, and she had been thinking this for weeks. She said, "Are you floating?"
So floating is a term that was invented in the 70s where your cult identity, your real identity, and you're
Mhm.
like going back and forth and you're not like really anchored and being out.
Right. Yeah, and she nailed me because I was there working, thinking that I had to work like I did when I was with Meehan, you know?
Yep.
Um, and I felt compelled to, you know, the there's kind of poor management there. And so I felt compelled to identify and plug the holes, you know? Just to
Yeah,
share.
boundaries. Healthy boundaries is a good thing for former members to learn.
Right. I'll tell you
What is
what.
a healthy leader supposed to act like? What does an unethical leader act like? What, and just to really get super clear on identifiable behaviors so you can protect yourself and friends and family and coworkers.
Right. But it's good to hear that I'm not alone in that after, 20 years or whatever.
It's completely normal, and unfortunately, most mental health professionals don't know, in my opinion, how to do proper therapy with a former member. Some of them are former members, and you might get lucky and have a good match because they've done their work on themselves and they can share their strategies. But a lot
Sure.
of people are now hanging out a shingle saying they can get people out of QAnon or they can get people out of any type of cult, and they know nothing.
Right, right. Yeah, and I've come across, and I'm not willing to risk it. I want to find a therapist who knows their stuff. I mean, if they don't know the bite model, right?
Well,
They
at
don't
this
know
point,
the
it's
area.
become acknowledged as the easier to understand, easier than Lifton, certainly.
Uh-huh.
Although, as you know, we just posted a latest interview that I just did a couple of weeks ago. He's 95 years old. But, he was a psychoanalyst, and psychoanalysts have a different take than I'm a pragmatist. Like, I want to help people reclaim their mind, their body, their internal locus of control as quickly as possible, give them a set of tools, and wish them goodbye. I don't want them to be dependent on me. I don't want them to look to me as a guru or to tell them what to do with their life.
Right.
I'd rather refer them to other people. If they need a tune up for an hour here or there, I'm open to, problem solving with them or whatever.
Right. Well, when I left, um, I got sent out to the desert by Bob Meehan, um, and to spend a week in isolation to find my true sociopathic male self because I had too many feelings, right? Um, and and he planted all these fears. You're going to think we have your wife screwing some other guy, or that we've moved your family to another town. You're going to, you know,
Which
um,
are all hypnotic suggestions.
exactly. Well, and the way he did it was, first, I walked up to him and he whacked me with a stick, right? Which was great
No, I don't
hypnotic.
know that, but sounds like he was back in jail grooming.
Well, it was hypnotic induction, right?
Yep.
And then he said, "That's real. Your fear isn't real." And these are the things you're going to be afraid of when you're out there, and you have to fight through those things, right? And so when I was out there for a week, what ended up happening was exactly the opposite of what he thought would happen. And that's when I woke up and said, I got to get out of here.
Yeah, being away from the cult and the cult leader is the first step to reclaiming your power. Just like
Right.
stop.
No contact with any of them for a
Yep.
week. But my wife was, and we had a daughter, and it took a year to get her to be willing to leave. And of course, I couldn't give any indication to anyone that I was anything other than the most devoted follower.
Right.
Everything got reported from the spouse. And I used, uh, I went out and bought Combating Cult Mind Control again, which I had read earlier. And I used techniques in there to try to, do the best I could to like remind her of before we were in the cult when we first met, what her life was like before. Imagine,
Right.
what will the future be like? What will it be like in the cult? What would it be like if we, weren't here? And of course, having to do all that without giving any indication,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, it's you're not alone in that either. I deal with a lot of people in the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons who are married with multiple kids, and they're trying to get their spouse out so the kids aren't just raised and indoctrinated into the cult. It's not easy. It's not
No,
easy at all.
but there came a point, and she wanted to have another child, and she went to Joy Meehan for permission. And I knew when she did it, I knew it was going to be bad. And I knew that might be my opportunity. Right. And I've been planting these seeds for a year.
Right. So she
And
said, don't have another child, but your wife's desire to have another child was more important to her.
well, it wasn't just don't have another child. It was, making her feel really bad about herself for wanting to have another child.
Oh yeah, because you have to spend all your time in the group serving. You don't want a lot of cult leaders don't want kids to interrupt.
Yeah. No, yeah. There's no way they wanted us to be having to deal with another child, and all of that. I mean, I was having to run all these different, the training and the treatment centers and all of that. I mean, I didn't have time to,
Right.
even go to the hospital for a baby to be born.
I'm so glad you're out, Dave. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for speaking out, sharing your story. In wrapping up, just take a moment and think, what else do you want to say? And then when we do the blog, you'll have a chance to give links and add some other points if you think of them. But you were able to do the bite model color coded for this group. That should help a lot of people.
The thing that I think that I would want to say is what you've said so many times, is, it's possible that you have a loved one that's in a cult. It's possible that you're in a cult, and it's possible that the person that's trying to reach out to you right now, from a business group or, a self-help group or,
Religious
religion.
group, multi-level
Yeah.
marketing group.
Just be careful. I had clues along the way, and there were times that I was very uncomfortable. And the other thing I would say is, I love my parents, but I'll tell you, my dad was, you got to get a job. Where can you get a job? That's the most important thing. You got to get on with your life. You really need to let this stuff go.
Oh, my father said the same thing in 1976.
Right.
You paid your
Right.
dues, Steve. Move on. Don't, this was a traumatic thing. And he didn't want to hear about it anymore. He had been abused too.
Right. Right. As a father, I would hope that I would encourage, if my children went through something like that, I would encourage them to take some time.
Thank you.
Get okay.
Yeah, that's huge. And also, it's their life. So they need to be true to themselves. They've been in an environment where they kept being told that they suck and that they have all these defective things and they have to follow the external authority figure. And what families should be doing is empowering their loved ones to think for themselves and learn how to make good decisions, how to reality test, and not think for them and tell them what they think that the person should do.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, it takes a village. David Cherry, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And much success, and please stay in touch.
Of course.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.